The astronauts continued by Stanislaw. Translated from the German by the Spirit of Hegel. The Dead Star. All this time the Earth seemed to be growing. An ever-increasing portion of its surface became visible the further we moved away from it. In the 17th hour of our flight, it reached its greatest diameter. It was downright frightening to gaze upon this colossus, which was looming ever more terrifyingly, from which a dense white glow erupted. Then what Soltke had described happened, but which one cannot comprehend unless one witnessed it. The division of the world into heaven and earth disappeared. The earth itself began to become a part of the sky, a star, first as a huge sphere covering 3/4 of the field of vision, then its curvature seemingly flattened. The radiance became fainter, and by 7 o'clock in the morning the entire whitish disk with the dark patches of the oceans was already visible on the television screen. Meanwhile, the rocket approached the moon. At first it looked as if it were flying past its right side. I left my notes and watched as the moon shifted on the television screen, so that the nose of the rocket was finally directed towards the North Pole. I went to the control center, where I met Soltik and Arseniev. They set up a huge camera with a telephoto lens in front of the fluorescent screen. The cosmocrator was scheduled to fly past the moon at a distance of just under 500 kilometers, and the astronomer wanted to take a series of photographs on this occasion, from quarter of an hour to a quarter of an hour. The moon's disk grew larger, and the piercing mercurial glare, reminiscent of the cold glow of a quartz lamp, intensified. Shortly after 11 o'clock, the dark spots and streaks on the surface began to dissect. Soon they stood out increasingly clearly and sharply against the background as ring-shaped mountain ranges with central volcanic cones. It was as if the white glowing hemisphere of the moon were displacing the black sky from the fluorescent screen. By 2 o'clock, we had already approached within 30,000 kilometers. Since the propulsion engines were running continuously again, the moon's gravitational pull was becoming quite unpleasantly noticeable. The weight of our bodies and all objects was subject to rapid changes, which manifested itself in us as a temporary feeling of dizziness. When the distance was only a little over 20,000 kilometers, Zoltik, who had briefly turned off the engines, switched off the gyroscopic motion of the rocket. Then there was another surprise. I wanted to lean on the back of the chair, but suddenly I rose into the air. My body was only a sixth of its normal weight. However, I hardly noticed this phenomenon, as I was captivated by the overwhelming sight that presented itself down there. While the rocket's movement hadn't been noticed at all in the morning, the flight now, with only a few thousand kilometers separating us from the moon, gave the impression of a terrible crash. We were over the Altai Mountains. It looked like petrified dirt with hoof prints frozen in it. These prints were actually craters, hundreds of kilometers in diameter, but there was nothing in our field of vision that would have allowed us to estimate their true size by comparison. The engines were silent. Carried along by the speed we had reached, we followed the tangent, and like a fired bullet, were supposed to fly very close to the edge of the moon. Our own speed added up to the moon's rotational speed, and the motion of the disk beneath us accelerated with every second. At 2:40, the distance was only 1,100 kilometers. Suddenly, Mountain formations appeared behind the horizon, which stretched in a gigantic arc to both sides. Their peaks sparkled in the sun like the glowing teeth of a saw that tore apart the plain beneath us, only to disappear after a few minutes on the other side of the horizon. Eerie was the deadly sweep of the crater rims, their rugged slopes standing out in the brightest sunlight, while their interiors lay in impenetrable darkness. If you watched for long, you felt dizzy. This frantic rush of stone forms in the boundless desert, eroded by deep cracks and crevices, this chaos of light and shadow, drew you into the depths like an abyss. Everywhere on the rocky slopes surrounding the cones of the volcanoes, and on the stony plain, flashing streaks of lava reflected the light. As the continuously working radar altimeter informed us, the distance had decreased to 200 kilometers a few minutes after the 3-minute mark. To the north of us, the Tycho de Brahe crater loomed by with its gigantic fan of solidified lava, more than 1,000 kilometers in circumference, covering the low ridges and mountain slopes all around. We approached the terminator, the line that separates the illuminated part of the dead star from the unlit part. There, at the boundary between day and night, the horizontal rays of the sun, running almost parallel to the ground, carved a ghostly architecture into the rocks. From the nightscape, the peaks of the highest peaks protruded like incandescent needles. Below and in front of us lay the plain of the star sea, on which I had spotted a dark, needle-thin line moving at tremendous speed. I followed it with excitement. Suddenly I understood. It was the shadow of the rocket. I wanted to point this out to Soltek, who was standing close to me, but he had already noticed. He turned his stern face to me, etched with the excitement of the last few hours, but already crossed by a slight smile. Suddenly the large fluorescent screen went out like a blown-out candle flame. We were plunged into complete darkness. Since no lamps were lit, nothing could be distinguished in the control center. Soltek switched the telescreen to the radar, and in the darkness that reigned in the cabin, the greenish-brown outlines of the lunar craters appeared. Directly beside us, as if hanging freely in space, the numbers on the predictor's instruments flickered, and on the glass screen over which all three of us were leaning, a glow swam that seemed to rise from the seabed. It transformed our faces into eerie masks. Meanwhile, the cosmic crater had plunged into the cone of shadow cast by the moon and continued to roar at the same speed. A short time later, we experienced the process we had observed upon approaching the moon, but in reverse. The relief of the surface gradually blurred. The circular formations of the ring mountains became smaller and smaller, converging toward the center of the screen. The surface of the satellite seemed to rotate slower and slower until it appeared to stand still. The moon, now once again a sphere half illuminated, half shrouded in darkness, lay behind us. Soltik turned on the light, took the camera, and went to the laboratory with the astronomer. I remained alone and sat in front of the fluorescent screen which showed the section of space in front of the rocket. Into the silence the Geiger counters ticked brightly. Each of these tones indicated that a particle of cosmic radiation had penetrated the walls of the rocket, its protective shell of water. Occasionally the slow, steady ticking experienced considerable acceleration. Apparently we were then speeding through a beam of radiation emitted by some alien celestial body. In the afternoon, Celtic asked me to check the oxygen capsules in which we were to move on the surface of Venus. The engineer was a decent man. I knew this work was neither urgent nor necessary. Celtic had met me, but I was wandering aimlessly inside the rocket and simply wanted to give me something to do. So I headed to the upper deck, to the cargo holds. Every time you climb up the vertical shaft, you feel something very strange. The body becomes weightless, because in the long axis zone of the rocket, centrifugal force loses its effect. And here, if one pushes off the rungs of the ladder, one can remain suspended freely in the air for a long time, with that strange feeling of disembodiment one sometimes experiences in dreams. Our scuba diving suits were, of course, in perfect condition. They consist of a suit and a helmet that can be removed quickly and easily. The suit is made of a soft but very durable synthetic wool fabric and weighs just under 3 pounds. The helmet forms a cone, rounded at the tip, thus being widest at the base. Chandrasekhar described its shape as a hyperboloid of revolution. Concave reflectors covered with a metal grid protrude from both sides. These are the antennas of a small radar device, whose screen is located inside the helmet at mouth level. An oval disc is attached to the eyes, which provides good visibility under normal conditions. The radar device can be used in the dark or in fog. We wore these protective suits on Earth for several days in a row, and were convinced that they were very comfortable. However, one looks a bit uncanny in them, especially since the round metal ears have a bat-like appearance. In addition to many other devices, such as electrical heating and cooling devices, an instrument for detecting radiation, and the oxygen apparatus, the diver also has a radio, a receiver and transmitter combined, that is no bigger than a fountain pen. The problem of accommodating the necessary coils, wires, and capacitors was solved in a very ingenious way. They had been painted with chemical silver ink onto the glass of the tubes. The radio is a small tube device, and then burned in like glaze. This creates contact so permanent that to damage them the entire device would have to be smashed. The device transmits on a wave of 20 centimeters, thus having a range of approximately 4 kilometers on the plane. From a higher point, for example, a mountain peak or an aeroplane, the radius of action increases to 150 kilometers. I checked the kilometer again and inspected the cargo bay to enjoy the sight of the Arctic and high-altitude equipment. When I returned to the control center, Oskovich, Arseniev, and Lautu were engaged in a mysterious activity, listening to the stars. Cylindrical coils located at the front of the rocket, collecting electromagnetic waves emitted by the stars, which, after passing through the amplifier system, create flickering greenish lines on the cathode screen of the oscilloscopes. The scientists, communicating with each other only with a few words, entered the numbers into the observation log. When Arseniev noticed me, he smiled kindly and turned on the loudspeaker. The radiation from the stars transformed into a tone. One heard a dull rattling, interrupted by a short, sharp whistling. "That's how the stars speak to us," said the astronomer. He was no longer smiling. Involuntarily, I, too, became serious. Once you've been living in the rocket for a while, you quickly get used to the strange phenomena of this equipment, this environment. And yet there are moments when you suddenly feel that only a thin metal shell separates you from the bottomless black void, the realm of electric waves and glowing gas clouds. In the afternoon, I had 4 hours of navigation duty. Nothing special happened during this time. It was only until evening that I got some work. One of the pipes in the lock station had sprung a leak and had to be welded. When I had completed this repair, I returned with the pleasant feeling of being lighter. Physical exhaustion. I returned to my cabin. At night I dreamed that I was a little boy again. Grandfather had promised to take me on a mountain hike when the weather was nice. In my childhood bedroom, by the window, stood an aquarium. The water reflected the sun's rays and cast them as white swirls against the ceiling. Then I awoke and saw a bright round spot above me. I sat up. The sun was shining. I was looking forward to the trip with Grandpa, but in the next second, the deceptive dream shattered. I slowly sank back onto the cushion. The white spot on the television screen was the Earth.